wife Susan is in Iowa visiting her folks, so she's not with us this morning, but sends her greetings. And I'm delighted to be here again, as always. When I was preparing for today's text, I came across a story about an organist in the congregation. And she and the pastor were meeting before the service to plan during the week and said, you know, I've never understood this text. Let's just skip it this year. That's the temptation, I have to confess. This is sort of an odd text. It's a text about a manager who's dishonest, and he's going to get fired. And so he decides to write off some of his boss's earnings so that he will make some friends, curry some favor. And the master says to him, good job. You've been shrewd. Kind of an odd story. In my first parish, I served another pastor, and the pastor said he never understood this story until he came upon a man who had been a local to an area. And there were troops in that area, they were seeking to buy produce, and when they bought it from the managers in the market, they spent quite a bit for it. And this man said, I can get it for you much cheaper. Because he didn't have the same markup. He didn't mark up the produce as much. So one possibility here is that this dishonest manager was just taking down the markup. In other words, he wasn't taking his cut, he was just giving the people, if you will, their bill at cost, so to speak. You know, at invoice when you go to the auto dealer. Well, the problem with that is that the manager, the manager's boss, the rich man, said, well, you've been shrewd. Shrewd. If someone just had took a cut, they were being generous, not shrewd. Shrewd suggests this guy was doing something else. You see, he put the rich man in kind of a tough position. Do you remember not too long ago, you may not have heard about this, but I understand that United Airlines had a little glitch online, and so they were giving away tickets for free and for $4 and things like that. And they had a decision to make after that. What should we do? Should we say, hey, we made a mistake, these tickets aren't any good, you need to pay up? And they decided, no, we're just going to let it ride and let it stand. Now this rich man was in a similar spot. After this manager of his had given everybody a discount, what was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to say, no, my manager screwed up, I need everything from you? That wouldn't have been so good, right? So he kind of put the rich man over a barrel. He'd been shrewd. Well, I'm not sure. Again, I do think the man had been shrewd, so what are we to make of this story? What should we make of it? One aspect of it, seems to me, comes out of the fact that the manager is going to be fired, had another option. He could have gone out and, if you will, strong-arm the rich man's debtors. You know, slap him up a little bit, threaten him in some way, and collect all the money for his boss in the hope that maybe his boss would hire him back. Could have become a hard guy, you know? Slap people around a bit. It was his last opportunity to do that. It's a temptation to do that in life. To expect as much of others, more of others sometimes, than we even expect of ourselves. A story. Listen, son, I'm saying this as you lie asleep. One little paw crumpled under your cheek and the blonde curls sticky wet on your damp forehead. I've stolen into your room alone. Just a few minutes ago, as I sat reading my paper in the library, a stifling wave of remorse swept over me. Guiltily, I came to your bedside. These are the things I was thinking, son. I've been cross to you. I scolded you as you were dressing for school because you gave your face merely a dab with a towel. I took you to task for not cleaning your shoes. I called out angrily when you threw some of your things on the floor. At breakfast, I found fault too. You spilled things. You gulped down your food. You put your elbows on the table. You spread butter too thick on your bread. And as you started off to play and I made for my train, you turned and waved a hand and called, goodbye, Daddy. I frowned and said in reply, hold your shoulders back. Then it began all over again in the late afternoon. As I came up the road, I spied you down on your knees playing marbles. There were holes in your socks. I humiliated you before your friends by marching ahead of me to the house. Socks were expensive. If you had to buy them, you'd be more careful. Imagine that, son. Do you remember later, when I was reading in the library, said nothing, but ran across in one tempestuous plunge and threw your arms around my neck and kissed me, and your small arms tightened with affection that God had sent blooming in your heart, that even neglect could not wither. And then you were gone, pattering up the stairs. Well, son, it was shortly thereafter that my paper slipped from my hands and a terrible, sickening fear came over me. What has habit been doing to me? The habit of finding fault, of reprimanding. This was my reward to you for being a boy. It was not that I did not love you. It was that I expected too much of you. I was measuring you by the yardstick of my years. There was so much that was good and fine and true in your character. The little heart of you was as big as the dawn itself of the wide hills. This was shown by your spontaneous impulse to rush in and kiss me goodnight. Nothing else matters tonight, son. I've come to your bedside in darkness. I've knelt here ashamed. As a feeble moment, I knew you would not understand these things if I had told them to you during your waking hours. But tomorrow I'll be a real daddy. I'll chum with you and suffer when you suffer. Laugh when you laugh. I'll bite my tongue when impatient words come. I'll keep saying as if it were a ritual, he's a little boy. Let him be a little boy. I'm afraid I have visualized you as a man, yet I see you now, son, crumpled and weary in your bed. I see that you're still a baby. Yesterday you were in your mother's arms and your head on her shoulder. I've asked too much of you, yet given too little of myself. Promise me as I teach you to have manners of a man that you will remind me how to have the fighting spirit of a child. It seems to me that those words are a reminder to us to be gracious to one another. I don't know how this manager had behaved with others before, and arguably he wasn't just purely being gracious. He was trying to curry favor. He wanted people to help him afterwards. But still, there was a graciousness in what he did. He could have chosen another path. He could have chosen another path. It's not just with children we are impatient, we are often impatient with one another. Some of what this story about, it seems to me, is having grace to be kind to one another. I'm reminded of a saying that one of my colleagues had as the backdrop for her computer screen that said something to the effect, you would think that the fact that we all die would be enough to make us love one another. Part of the text, I think. The other part, it seems to me, has to do with doing what's in our own interests. As I suggested, this manager was doing what was in his own interests. He was trying to make sure that he didn't have to work too hard after he lost his job. He didn't want to be on the streets with a sign, need food, and he didn't want to be digging ditches. When I was headed off to college, my dad gave me a little statue of a guy with a really big hoe, bent over digging in the dirt, and he told me, well, you decide you don't want to go to college, there's always something else you can do. This man knew he didn't want to go there. And so when he forgave these people their debts, at least half their debts or part of their debts, he was doing something that was in his own interest. He was watching out for himself by making friends, by giving things away. We have a hard time looking out for our own interests sometimes. That's part of what Jesus is saying. You children of light, you know what it is to look out for your own interests, but you have a hard time doing it. You can learn something from this guy. Another story. I once wished I could erase the image from my memory. My firstborn child, the boy I loved with all my heart, glaring at me as I turned to walk away and leave him in a juvenile treatment center. I hate you, he screamed, and his rage pierced me like a knife. I never want to see you again. How had things gone so terribly wrong, I agonized. And yet that image is now a reminder of how far my son has come, of the love that helped him when his family could not. Andy had always been a little mischievous, so his stepdad, Dan, and I didn't worry too much when teachers complained that he disrupted the class. All he needs is a little discipline and a lot of love, we told each other. We'd take him fishing when he'd been good and ground him when he hadn't, but his behavior only got worse. He'd fight with kids at school and fly into rages at home. Nothing we did, pleading, taking away privileges, had any impact on him. In the 4th grade, Andy was diagnosed with learning disabilities and put in a special class. He'll get the attention he needs, I told himself. Each day when I returned from my job as a corrections officer at prison, I'd ask him, how was school? Fine, he'd tell me. So I was shocked when his school called to say he'd been absent for 4 weeks. "But why, Andy?" I entreated him. "I just hate it, that's all," he said. I now realize that his learning disabilities must have made him feel dumb and angry at himself, so he tried to stop caring. By 13, Andy was hanging out with a wild crowd, smoking and fighting. Again, we tried punishment, lectures, even therapy, but nothing helped. My other sons, Justin 10, and Joshua 2, were well-behaved. 2-year-old well-behaved? Really? I couldn't help but remember the good counsel I got as a child from my parents, from my loving, Bible-trusting grandparents. I tried so hard to pass along the same values. What was wrong? What was I doing wrong with Andy? I agonized. "Lord, help me," I whispered. One night, Andy was arrested for breaking into a home just for kicks. "What's the matter with you?" I screamed. At work, I kept looking into the hard eyes of prisoners and thinking, if Andy keeps up like this, he'll end up here. But it was a call from Andy's guidance counselor that finally pushed me to take action. When she asked him why he hadn't done his homework, he shrugged and said, "I don't know. I think I'll just shoot myself." Chills raced down my spine. This has to stop now. I phoned a juvenile center I'd heard about called Greenleaf. Maybe they can help, I thought. After Andy's first week of treatment, his counselor called. Andy was breaking every rule. When I cried in frustration, Dan reassured me, "He'll get better." But each week the news was the same. Andy was hostile. Andy kicked in a wall. Andy hated life. Then one day his counselor told me Andy had begun opening up in therapy. It's a start, I told myself, feeling a rush of hope. Next week Andy called, and when I heard his voice, I gasped. Miraculously, his anger was gone, and in his place was an unfamiliar lilt. "Hey, Mom," he said cheerfully, "I miss you. How are you?" Each week brought even better reports. Andy was doing well in class and speaking with respect. "His progress is incredible," his counselor told me. 4 months after Andy entered the program, he came home for good. And I saw his eyes, something I hadn't seen for years: joy. Now the son who had left in a fury was offering to babysit for Joshua and do chores. Soon he returned to school in regular class. I felt grateful to Greenleaf, assuming they'd work magic, and in many ways they had. But a year later, I found out Andy had extra help. One night, the family was sitting around our fireplace when Andy said, "Mom, there's something I never told you." He shared a dream he'd had about 2 months after arriving at Greenleaf. He was walking down a dirt road and came to an old house where an elderly woman sat on the porch reading her Bible. She was short and stout, he said, with white hair in a bun and beautiful blue eyes. She was wearing a white fringe shawl with some kind of diamond pattern. He didn't notice the tears in my eyes, and he went on. "I told her I was thirsty and asked for a drink of water," he said. She looked at me and said, "Andy, you're going the wrong way." I asked again, and she said, "Andy, I'm your great-grandmother, and you've got to change your ways." "I can't explain it, Mom," Andy said, but that next day I felt different, less angry. The dream stayed with me for a long time. I was sobbing. "Oh, Andy, she was your great-grandmother." As the children listened dumbstruck, I told them how I used to sit with my grandmother on her porch as she read her Bible. She looked exactly as Andy had described. She died a month before Andy was born. In her will, she left me her favorite fringe shawl with a diamond pattern. Though I'd spoken a little to Andy about Granny, he'd never seen a picture of her past age 30, and the shawl had been tucked away since she passed on. "She must have been sent to help me," Andy cried. I smiled and nodded. That night, as I checked on my sleeping children, I whispered, "Thank you, God, and thank you, Granny." Andy didn't know what was in his own interests. It took a visit from his great-grandmother to learn. Many of us, at least myself, am often in the same boat. While I may know it's in my own interest, I don't necessarily do it. And there are times when I forget what is in